Suspended 5 miles above the English Channel, Oberleutnant Karl von Richt sneered through his frosted oxygen mask. A formation of new American fighters had just lumbered into his crosshairs, and they were laughably grotesque. To the elite German pilots flying sleek Focke-Wulf 190s, these 7-ton Republic P-47 Thunderbolts resembled flying milk jugs, clumsy and agonizingly slow to turn. It looked like an effortless morning of target practice. But the Luftwaffe's mockery was about to become a fatal mistake. Hidden inside the wings of these bloated metal monstrosities waited a devastating surprise. 8 synchronized 5.0 caliber machine guns, primed to unleash an inescapable tidal wave of armor-piercing lead. Captain Terence Hayes stood on the damp tarmac of RAF King's Cliff in the early spring of 1943, staring up at the imposing metal cliff of the Republic P-47C Thunderbolt. It was not a beautiful machine. Beside the graceful, elliptical wings of a British Supermarine Spitfire, the American fighter looked like a cargo locomotive, with wings bolted onto its flanks. Fully loaded, it weighed over 7 tons. It was almost twice the weight of a Spitfire, built around a colossal Pratt & Whitney R. 2,800 double wasp radial engine that demanded a fuselage so fat a pilot could practically stand up inside it. Terence shoved his hands deep into the pockets of his fleece-lined leather jacket, exhaling a plume of white breath into the bitter English air. Around him, the men of the 56th Fighter Group were adjusting to their new reality. They had been shipped across the Atlantic, eager to take the fight to the Luftwaffe, only to be handed the keys to what the British pilots jokingly referred to as a 7-ton flying milk jug. An RAF Spitfire pilot, a flight lieutenant with a heavily scarred cheek from the Battle of Britain, wandered over and patted the massive steel belly of Terence's plane. "Right, big piece of kit. Isn't she, Yank?" the Brit said, a smirk playing on his lips. "If you ever get into a spot of bother with a Focke-Wulf, just unstrap from your seat and run around in the fuselage to dodge the bullets." Terence managed a tight smile, though the joke struck a raw nerve. "She's got armor, at least. And the Pratt & Whitney has 2,000 horses. Horsepower doesn't win dogfights, mate," the RAF veteran warned softly. "Turning does. And I wouldn't want to try turning this bathtub against an Abbeville boy." The skepticism wasn't limited to the British. Across the Channel, the Luftwaffe had already been briefed on the arrival of the heavy American fighters. At a requisitioned French chateau near Saint-Omer, Oberleutnant Karl von Richt, a rising ace in Jagdgeschwader 26, the elite Schlageter wing, poured a glass of cognac for his commanding officer, the legendary Major Egon Mayer. "They are compensating for a lack of skill with an excess of metal," von Richt laughed, viewing a reconnaissance photograph of a P-47 on the briefing table. "Look at the drag on that airframe. The wing loading must be atrocious. They build excellent tractors in America, Major, but this is a sky filled with wolves. A tractor will only get slaughtered." Mayer, a pragmatist who respected any machine with guns, sipped his drink. "Do not underestimate them, Karl. It is a heavy machine, yes, but gravity favors the heavy." Von Richt waved his hand dismissively. "Let them come. My Schwarm will fly rings around them." The terrible reality of the Thunderbolt's initial inadequacy was laid bare during its first major combat sweeps over occupied France in April 1943. The 56th Fighter Group, tasked with drawing the Luftwaffe up into combat, flew high over the coast in sprawling formations. Terence Hayes, flying as a wingman in a 4-ship flight, felt the sluggishness of his massive aircraft in the thin air at 25,000 feet. Suddenly, the radio crackled with static and panic. "Bandits, 6 o'clock high, coming out of the sun." Von Richt and a dozen yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf 190s fell upon the American formation like falcons striking pigeons. The Fu 190, a masterpiece of German engineering, was light, incredibly fast in a roll, and packed a lethal combination of machine guns and 20mm cannons. "Break right," Terrence's flight leader shouted. Terrence yanked the heavy control stick, stomping the right rudder pedal. The Thunderbolt responded, but with the lumbering momentum of a freight train. By the time he had banked the 7-ton beast, von Richt's Focke-Wulf had already flashed past, its cannons tearing through the tail of Terrence's flight leader. The American plane exploded in a tragic blossom of orange flame and black smoke. Panic seized the American formation. Instinctively, the P-47 pilots tried to pull into tight, looping turns to get behind the nimble German fighters, the exact maneuver they had been taught in flight school. It was a fatal mistake. The Thunderbolt bled speed rapidly in a hard turn. Von Richt, pulling 3 Gs with effortless grace, easily slipped inside Terrence's turning radius. Looking over his shoulder, Terrence saw the unmistakable, terrifying silhouette of the Fu-190 squarely in his rearview mirror. The leading edges of the German's wings sparked with cannon fire. Thick thuds echoed through Terrence's cockpit as 20mm explosive shells slammed into the Thunderbolt's tail and fuselage. The sheer noise was deafening, a chaotic symphony of tearing aluminum and shattering glass. But the P-47 did not fold. Its massive armored bathtub surrounding the cockpit and the heavy engine block up front absorbed the punishment that would have sawed a Spitfire or a Mustang in half. "I can't shake him," Terrence screamed into the radio, desperately kicking the rudders to skid out of the line of fire. He threw the throttle wide open, but the heavy plane's acceleration was agonizingly slow. "Dive, Hayes! Push the nose down!" roared a voice over the chaotic frequency. It was Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, the fierce commander of the 56th Fighter Group. Terrence violently shoved the stick forward. The massive nose of the Thunderbolt dropped toward the French countryside 20,000 feet below. Gravity, combined with the immense weight of the aircraft, took over. The airspeed indicator spun wildly, 300, 400, nearly 500 miles per hour. Behind him, von Richt pushed his throttle to the firewall, intending to follow the American down and finish the kill. But to the Germans' absolute astonishment, the flying bathtub was pulling away. The P-47 was dropping like an anvil, an unstoppable metallic meteorite plummeting through the atmosphere. The Fu-190, lighter and hampered by differing aerodynamics at extreme dive speeds, physically could not keep up. Von Richt pulled out of the dive at 10,000 feet, watching the battered American fighter shrink to a speck as it hurtled toward the safety of the English Channel. He clicked his radio to speak to his flight. "Let them run. They cannot turn. They cannot climb. We own this sky." Terrence limped his shattered Thunderbolt back to King's Cliff, the hydraulic lines bleeding fluid, the tail section looking like Swiss cheese. When his wheels finally kissed the runway, the right tire blew out, sending the massive plane spinning into the muddy grass. He threw back the canopy, trembling violently, surrounded by the smell of scorched metal and high-octane fuel. He had survived, but the morale of the 56th Fighter Group was in tatters. The Germans were laughing at them. They were flying, sitting ducks. The briefing room at Horsham St. Faith, where the 56th had recently relocated, was thick with cigarette smoke and grim faces. 3 empty chairs sat in the front row, silent testaments to the pilots lost in the disastrous sweep over Abbeville. Colonel Hub Zemke stood at the front, a chalkboard behind him. Zemke was a hard-bitten, uncompromising commander who possessed a rare analytical mind for aerial combat. He did not coddle his men. He looked at the defeated expressions of his pilots, stopping his gaze on a heavily bandaged Terrence Hayes. "I hear the British are having a good laugh at our expense," Zemke began, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the silence. "I hear the Krauts are painting kill markers on their tails because you boys think you're flying crop dusters at a county fair." He picked up a piece of chalk and drew 2 crude airplanes on the board. "You are trying to fight their war," Zemke snapped, striking the board with the chalk. "You are trying to turn with a Focke-Wulf or a Messerschmitt. You might as well try to outrun a greyhound with a draft horse. The Thunderbolt is a 7-ton machine. When you pull back on that stick and drag it into a tight circle, you bleed off all your speed. You become a massive, stationary target. And then, you die. A young pilot from the back row raised his hand timidly. "Colonel," respectfully, "how the hell are we supposed to fight them if we can't turn with them? Should we petition 8th Air Force for P-51s? Zemke's eyes narrowed. "You will fight with the weapon you have been given, Lieutenant, because the weapon you have been given is an absolute monster if you stop treating it like a ballerina." Zemke turned to Captain Robert S. Johnson, one of the few pilots who had managed to score a hit in the previous weeks. "Bob, tell them." Johnson stood up, leaning against the wooden desk. "It's about energy," Johnson said, his tone deadpan and serious. "Altitude is life. Speed is life. We have a massive engine and a massive airframe. We don't engage in dogfights. We fight in the vertical. We climb high above them. When we see the Luftwaffe, we push the nose over. We dive." Terrence rubbed his forehead. "I dove yesterday, Bob. That's the only reason I'm here. But that was to run away. Next time, you don't dive to run away," Zemke interrupted, his eyes blazing. "You dive to attack. You strike them at 500 miles per hour. You don't turn. You blast straight through their formation, tear them to shreds, and use the incredible momentum of your dive to zoom straight back up into the stratosphere, where they can't follow you. Boom and zoom. Hit and run. We dictate the terms of the engagement. We fight in the vertical plane, not the horizontal." It was a profound paradigm shift. For decades, fighter pilots had been trained in the romantic art of the turning dogfight, the swirling, horizontal dance, popularized by the biplanes of the First World War. Zemke was ordering them to throw out the rulebook. Over the next month, the 56th Fighter Group, soon to be known as Zemke's Wolfpack, underwent a brutal, grueling re-education. Terrence Hayes spent hours in the cockpit, pushing his new replacement P-47 to its absolute limits over the English countryside. He learned to trust the terrifying dive. The first time he deliberately pushed the nose straight down from 30,000 feet. The sheer roar of the air rushing over the canopy sounded like a hurricane tearing a tin roof apart. The controls became stiff, heavy as concrete due to compressibility, but the plane held together. It was a flying anvil, forged to withstand unbelievable aerodynamic stress. He also learned to intimately trust his armament. The Thunderbolt did not have a nose-mounted cannon like the German fighters. Instead, it housed 4 .50 caliber Browning M, 2 machine guns, tightly packed into each thick wing, 8 guns in total. When test firing them over the Wash, a large estuary on the east coast, the recoil of the 8 heavy machine guns was so violently powerful that it actually slowed the 7-ton aircraft down in midair. It fired a wall of armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds, roughly 110 rounds per second. It was an airborne broadside. But across the channel, arrogance remained entrenched. Oberleutnant Karl von Richt sat in the cockpit of his FULV 190, idling on the grass strip at Abbeville. He had painted 3 more kill marks on his rudder, all American P-47s. To him, the heavy American fighters were predictable. They flew high, they panicked when attacked, they tried to turn, and they died. "They are bringing their heavy bombers today," the radio crackled with the voice of his wingman, Dieter, heading toward the rail yards at Saint-Omer. "Excellent," von Richt smiled, adjusting his throat microphone. "Let the flak handle the bombers. We will hunt the escorts. Stay loose. Watch for their clumsy turning. Today we make the bathtub overflow." He pushed the throttle forward, the BMW radial engine of his Focke-Wulf roaring to life. Unaware that the American pilots he was flying up to meet were no longer the frightened, inexperienced boys he had slaughtered a month prior. They were initiates of the Wolfpack, and they had finally learned how to wield the hammer. The midsummer air of 1,943 at 28,000 feet was -40 degrees. Inside the cockpit of his Thunderbolt, Terrence Hayes fought off the bone-deep cold. Frost coated the edges of his canopy, and he had to periodically scrape it away with his gloved hand to maintain visibility. He breathed deeply through his rubber oxygen mask. The rhythmic hiss and click, the only sounds competing with the deafening drone of the massive R-2800 engine in front of him. Below them, a sprawling armada of B-17 flying fortresses churned through the sky, their four-engine hum vibrating through the atmosphere. They were a slow, majestic, and highly vulnerable target. Blue Flight, keep your eyes peeled, Colonel Zemke's voice crackled, sharp and clear. The Krauts know we're here. They'll try to come up from below, or bounce us from out of the sun. Maintain altitude. Do not bleed your speed. Terrence constantly scanned the horizon, his neck aching from the heavy leather helmet and goggles. He looked at the P-47s flying alongside him. They looked different to him now. No longer fat and clumsy, they looked like coiled springs. Tremendous kinetic energy waiting to be unleashed. Suddenly, silver flashes caught the sunlight far below, climbing steeply toward the bomber stream. Bandits! 9 o'clock low! Coming up fast on the bomber's port side, Terrence called out, his pulse spiking. I see them, Hayes, Zemke replied. Looks like a dozen Focke-Wulfs. Blue Flight, Red Flight. Drop external tanks. Arm your weapons. We're taking them from the top. Terrence reached down and pulled the lever to jettison the heavy external fuel tank beneath his fuselage. He felt the immediate shudder and lightness as the drag vanished. He reached up and flipped the red safety covers off his gun switches. Far below, Karl von Richt was focused intensely on the trailing element of the B-17 formation. He had intentionally climbed into the American's blind spot, using the glare of the sun. He intended to slash through the bombers, cripple one, and dive away before the cumbersome P-47 escorts even realized what had happened. It was a textbook hit-and-run tactic that had served JG-26 brilliantly for over a year. Schwarm, form up, von Richt commanded. Target the straggler. Watch his tail gunner. He pulled his control stick back slightly, lining up his Reeve gun sight on the massive tail of the B-17. He was entirely focused on his prey, confident that no American fighter could outmaneuver him to intervene in time. He was right about one thing. They weren't going to try to outmaneuver him. All right, boys, Zemke's voice echoed like a judge handing down a sentence. Push him over. Let's go to work. High above, 16 P-47 Thunderbolts rolled inverted and pulled the noses of their massive aircraft straight down toward the earth. Terrence Hayes felt weightless for a split second before the heavy gravity took hold, pinning him to his seat straps. The 7-ton fighter dropped like a stone. The airspeed indicator whipped clockwise in a blur. 300, 400, 450 miles per hour. The heavy metal beast vibrated violently, the wind screaming over the airframe in an unearthly howl. The controls grew incredibly stiff, requiring Terrence to use both arms just to make minor corrections to his trajectory. He looked through his illuminated gun sight. Down below, von Richt's FAV 190 was growing larger by the millisecond, completely unaware of the metallic avalanches dropping from the stratosphere. At the last possible second, a German wingman, positioned slightly higher than von Richt, caught sight of the plummeting shapes. Herr Oberleutnant, brake! Brake hard! Thunderbolts dropping from above. Von Richt's combat instincts took over. He immediately abandoned the bomber, slamming his stick to the right to execute a snap roll and violently chop his throttle, intending to dive away and under the attacking Americans. It was the standard evasion maneuver against British Spitfires, which would inevitably overshoot such a drastic loss of altitude and speed. But Terrence Hayes wasn't in a Spitfire, and he wasn't trying to dogfight. Terrence adjusted his trim tabs, fighting the heavy controls, and adjusted his dive to perfectly intercept the path of the fleeing German. The Thunderbolt was hurtling downward at nearly 500 miles per hour. Its massive weight granting it an ungodly terminal velocity that the lighter Fu-190 simply could not match in a dive. Von Richt looked over his shoulder, expecting to see empty sky. Instead, his blood ran cold. The massive, ugly, radial engine of Terrence's P-47 was filling his entire rear-view mirror, closing the distance with terrifying, unstoppable speed. The flying bathtub was running him down. "Impossible," Von Richt hissed, shoving his throttle to maximum emergency power, desperate to escape the dive. At 400 yards, Terrence squeezed the trigger on the control stick. The physical shock of the Thunderbolt firing its armament was immense. 8.50 caliber, Browning M2 machine guns, staggered flawlessly inside the heavy wings, erupted simultaneously. A blinding torrent of orange tracer fire, interspersed with armor-piercing incendiary rounds, tore through the sky like a solid beam of light. Over 100 rounds a second. Von Richt had laughed at the P-47. He had mocked its size and its lack of grace. But in the fraction of a second that followed, the brutal reality of American industrial might crashed into his cockpit. The 8 streams of heavy lead converged at exactly 300 yards, a pinpoint funnel of pure kinetic destruction. The Fu-190 did not just take damage, it was practically erased from the sky. The armor-piercing rounds effortlessly shattered the Focke-Wulf's canopy, sheared the right horizontal stabilizer completely off the tail, and punched fist-sized holes straight through the armor plating behind Von Richt's seat. Incendiary rounds ignited the fuel lines in the right-wing root. Terrence watched, awestruck by the sheer violence of his own machine, as the sleek, beautiful German fighter instantly turned into a brilliant, blooming fireball of wreckage. There was no turning fight. There was no elegant dogfight. There was only the brutal, inescapable geometry of speed, mass, and overwhelming firepower. Terrence immediately pulled back on the heavy stick. The incredible momentum from his dive catapulted the heavy Thunderbolt right back up into the vertical, rocketing toward the safety of 25,000 feet in a matter of seconds, leaving the burning debris of Von Richt's fighter tumbling harmlessly toward the French soil below. Over the radio, the frequency was eerily quiet for a moment, save for the heavy breathing of the pilots. Then, Zemke's voice broke the silence, carrying the faintest trace of dark satisfaction. "Good shooting, Blue 2. Reform at Angels 28. I don't think they're laughing at the jug anymore." Gravity, which had just served as the Grim Reaper for his beloved Focke-Wulf, was now the only thing keeping Karl von Richt alive. Hanging suspended in the straps of his silk parachute, the German aristocrat drifted slowly toward the patchwork fields of occupied France. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, grazed by a stray half-inch round that had punched through the cockpit armor as if it were cardboard. Below him, the flaming wreckage of his fighter left a black scar across a pristine meadow. When a Wehrmacht patrol finally recovered him 2 hours later, Von Richt was not the arrogant, laughing ace who had taken off from Saint-Omer. He was shivering, pale, and deeply terrified. Reporting back to Major Egon Mayer the next morning, with his arm in a sling and his uniform smelling of smoke and iodine, Von Richt found no sympathy. Mayer stood by the tall windows of the chateau, watching the rain lash against the glass. "They did not turn," Von Richt reported quietly, staring at the floorboards. "They fell out of the sun like anvils. I tried to slip under them, Major. I chopped the throttle, but he simply ran me down. The speed of his dive. And the guns. My God, the guns. It was like flying into a solid wall of iron." Mayer did not turn around. "We have received reports from JG2 and JG26 all morning. You were not the only one, Karl. 6 of our best pilots were shot down in exactly the same manner. The Americans have stopped playing our game. They are using their weight." Mayer finally turned, his face etched with grim realization. "They have figured out how to use the monster." Across the channel at RAF Halesworth, the atmosphere within the 56th Fighter Group had undergone a tectonic shift. The paralyzing fear of the FTU-190 had been replaced by a predatory, calculating confidence. The mechanics on the flight line, covered in grease and shivering in the damp chill, worked frantically to rearm the massive wings of the P-47S, feeding miles of belted AT-50 caliber ammunition into the bays. Captain Terence Hayes stood by his freshly painted Thunderbolt, watching a newly arrived pilot, Captain Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, inspect the imposing 8-gun layout. Gabreski, a man who would soon become one of the most legendary aces in American history, ran a gloved hand over the gun ports. "I flew Spitfires with the Poles before I got here," Gabreski said, his voice carrying a mix of awe and skepticism. "A Spitfire feels like a sports car. This thing feels like a bank vault. Are you telling me you actually hit things at 500 miles an hour?" "You don't just hit them, Gabby," Terence replied, leaning against the massive landing gear strut. "You obliterate them." Hub was right. If you try to dance with them, you're dead. But if you start high, point the nose down, and pull the trigger, well, nothing survives 850s. The recoil is so hard it practically knocks your teeth out, but it throws a buzzsaw into the sky. The tactical evolution of Zemke's Wolfpack was ruthless. They operated under a new doctrine: bounce, blast, and climb. The P-47S escorted the heavy B-17S and B-24S deeper into Europe, utilizing new drop tanks to extend their range. When the Luftwaffe rose to intercept the bombers, the Thunderbolts, loitering high in the freezing stratosphere, would drop upon them with devastating kinetic energy. The German pilots, who had previously viewed the Americans as clumsy amateurs, were now facing an organized, heavily armored firing squad. The P-47 was almost uncatchable in a dive, and its ruggedness meant that even if a German pilot managed to land a few desperate shots, the American plane rarely went down. Von Richt, flying a replacement Focke-Wulf a month after his near-death experience, witnessed this terrifying durability firsthand. Over the skies of Bremen, he managed to outmaneuver a young, inexperienced P-47 pilot who had foolishly tried to engage in a horizontal turning fight. Von Richt lined up his Reeve sight and poured a 2-second burst of 20mm explosive shells directly into the fuselage and wing root of the Thunderbolt. On a Spitfire or a Messerschmitt, this would have resulted in an instant, catastrophic mid-air disintegration. Instead, the P-47 merely shuddered. Chunks of aluminum blasted off the cowling, and thick black smoke poured from the exhaust. But the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine refused to die. The American pilot violently leveled his wings, pushed his nose down, and dove away, hauling the severely damaged 7-ton beast back toward England. Von Richt broke off the pursuit, a cold sweat prickling his neck. He had emptied half his ammunition into the plane, and it had simply shrugged it off and flown away. The laughter that had once echoed through the Luftwaffe messes was entirely gone, replaced by a creeping, dreadful respect for the jug. Winter approached, painting the European theater in freezing rains and brutal overcast skies. The air war intensified, becoming a grueling meat grinder of attrition. The 8th Air Force was pushing deeper into the Reich, targeting ball-bearing plants, oil refineries, and rail yards. The Luftwaffe fought with the desperate ferocity of cornered wolves. In November 1943, Terence Hayes found himself flying a sprawling, chaotic escort mission over the Ruhr Valley, a heavily industrialized region of Germany, famously known to Allied airmen as Flak Alley. The sky was a terrifying, polka-dotted canvas of black, bursting anti-aircraft shells. The concussions from the 88mm flak cannons were so violent, they tossed the 7-ton Thunderbolts around like toys in a bathtub. "Keep it tight, Blue Flight," Terence ordered over the crackling radio, his eyes constantly scanning the dark horizon. "We are in the thick of it." Below them, the B-17S were taking a merciless pounding, but the fighters were not immune. Suddenly, a deafening crack shattered the deafening roar of Terence's engine. The entire airframe violently lurched to the right. A burst of flak had detonated less than 20 feet beneath his right wing. The shockwave blew out his right side canopy glass and peppered the underside of his fuselage with jagged, glowing shrapnel. Red warning lights instantly illuminated across his instrument panel. The oil pressure gauge twitched and began a steady, horrifying drop. "I'm hit," Terrence called out, fighting the heavy control stick to keep the nose level. "Blue 3, take the lead. I'm losing oil pressure. I have to drop down." He pulled back his throttle to reduce the strain on the dying engine and began a shallow, agonizing descent away from the bomber stream. He was 100 miles from the English Channel, deep in hostile territory, flying a crippled aircraft. It was exactly the scenario Karl von Richt had been hunting for. Leading a swarm of 4 W-190s on a low-altitude patrol, von Richt spotted the smoking, descending P-47, limping through the broken clouds at 10,000 feet. His eyes narrowed. This was his chance to settle the score, to prove that the massive American machines could bleed and die, just like anything else. Straggler spotted. 10 o'clock high. Von Richt radioed his men. "He is damaged. I will take him. Cover my flanks." Von Richt pushed his throttle forward, the sleek German fighter rocketing upward to intercept the struggling Thunderbolt. He approached from the classic blind spot low and behind the American's right tail elevator. Inside the freezing, wind-blasted cockpit of his P-47, Terrence checked his 6 o'clock mirror. His stomach dropped. A yellow-nosed Focke-Wulf was closing fast, its silhouette expanding rapidly. "Damn it," Terrence muttered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He tried to push the throttle to emergency war power, but the damaged Pratt & Whitney engine coughed violently, vibrating the entire airframe. He couldn't dive away. He didn't have the altitude. He couldn't outrun him. He didn't have the engine power. Von Richt lined up the shot. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. He wasn't going to aim for the fuselage. He aimed directly for the massive, exposed radial engine at the front of the P-47. The few 190s cannons flashed. Heavy, 20 millimeters, Menengeschoss, high-capacity explosive shells slammed into the nose of Terrence's Thunderbolt. The impacts sounded like sledgehammers hitting a steel door. One shell exploded directly against the upper bank of engine cylinders. Oil violently sprayed across Terrence's shattered windshield, instantly blinding him. The engine screamed in mechanical agony, a horrific grinding of torn metal. Von Richt smiled tightly, pulling alongside the American, expecting to see the pilot bail out or the massive aircraft tumble into a fatal spin. He flew parallel to the Thunderbolt, barely 50 yards away, to watch his kill. But the impossible happened. The P-47 did not go down. Despite having an entire cylinder literally blown off the engine block, despite a shattered canopy, shredded elevators, and oil pouring from its cowling like blood from a severed artery, the R-2000, 800 double Wasp engine, kept churning. It was an engineering miracle, a testament to raw, brute force American manufacturing. It coughed, it spat flames, it shook violently, but it kept pulling the 7-ton beast through the sky. Terrence, blinded by the oil and running on pure adrenaline, wiped a small, smeared porthole clear on his canopy glass. He looked to his left and saw the German pilot staring at him in absolute shock. In that split second, Terrence didn't panic. He realized the German had bled off his own speed to fly alongside him and gloat. With a roar of defiance, Terrence violently stomped his left rudder pedal and yanked the heavy control stick back and to the left. The massive, crippled Thunderbolt skidded sideways through the air, turning its massive nose directly toward the hovering Focke-Wulf. Von Richt realized his fatal error, a fraction of a second too late. He had underestimated the Thunderbolt's sheer refusal to die. Terrence's thumb clamped down on the gun trigger. The 8.50 caliber machine guns, completely undamaged by the flak or the cannon fire, roared to life. At point-blank range, a concentrated torrent of armor-piercing fire ripped into the Focke-Wulf. The heavy rounds tore through the thin aluminum of the German fighter's wing, instantly severing the main spar and detonating the ammunition bays. Von Richt's plane violently snapped in half, instantly engulfed in a blinding flash of aviation fuel and explosive ordnance. Terrence immediately released the trigger, fighting the heavy controls to level his own ruined aircraft. The sky beside him was empty, save for a rain of burning debris falling toward the German forests below. He leaned back against his armored seat, his chest heaving, listening to the agonizing, rhythmic thumping of his heavily damaged engine. It was running on a fraction of its power, holding together by sheer structural defiance. It would be a long, terrifying, and freezing flight back to the English coast. But he was alive. The Thunderbolt wasn't just a heavy hitter anymore. It was an immortal tank with wings. And the skies over Europe would never be the same. Freezing wind howled through the shattered plexiglass of Captain Terence Hayes' canopy, carrying with it the sickening metallic stench of vaporized aviation fuel and burning oil. The immense Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine, missing an entire cylinder head and leaking vital fluids from a dozen jagged shrapnel wounds, vibrated so violently that the instrument dials on the dashboard were an unreadable blur. Terrence's hands were clamped onto the heavy control stick with a desperate, white-knuckled grip, fighting to keep the right wing from dropping into a fatal spiral. Every instinct drilled into him during flight training screamed at him to unbuckle his harness, slide back the canopy, and roll out into the freezing void over occupied Europe. Bailing out was the logical choice. The P-47 Thunderbolt was severely crippled, losing altitude at an agonizing rate of 200 feet per minute, but beneath him lay the frigid gray expanse of the North Sea. Ditching a 7-ton fighter plane in the winter swells was a guaranteed death sentence. The heavy engine block would pull the aircraft to the bottom in seconds, and even if he managed to deploy his life raft, the freezing water would stop his heart before air-sea rescue could even launch a Catalina flying boat. He had to make it to England. Mayday. Mayday. "This is Blue 2, Terence rasped into his throat microphone, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as the ambient temperature in the cockpit plunged to 30 below zero. "I am trailing smoke, severely damaged, making for the coast. Engine is eating itself alive." Static hissed back at him. The flak burst that had shredded his engine cowling had likely severed his radio antenna. He was entirely alone in a dying machine. To see through the thick layer of black, freezing oil smearing his windshield, Terence was forced to manually crank his seat upward and lean his head out into the slipstream. The slipstream hit his face like a physical blow, a torrent of icy daggers that instantly numbed his cheeks and nose. He squinted through his heavy goggles, desperately searching the bleak horizon for the familiar white chalk lines of the English cliffs. For 40 agonizing minutes, the Thunderbolt defied the laws of aerodynamics. The engine sounded like a cement mixer, filled with scrap iron, clanking and backfiring, spitting long tongues of orange flame past Terrence's right shoulder. Yet, the brutal, over-engineered American pistons continued to pump. The massive armored bathtub surrounding the cockpit held firm against the intense vibrations that would have rattled a lighter airframe to pieces. Finally, emerging from the coastal fog, like a ghostly apparition, the jagged white cliffs of Dover materialized. Terence slumped slightly in his shoulder straps, a ragged gasp escaping his lips. "Come on, you ugly beast," he whispered, patting the cold aluminum of the console. Just a few more miles. He spotted the flat green expanse of an emergency RAF landing strip near Manston. He reached down and yanked the lever to deploy his massive landing gear. The hydraulic pumps whined pitifully. The left wheel locked into place with a heavy clunk, but the right wheel, damaged by the 20mm cannon fire from von Richt's doomed Focke-Wulf, remained jammed in the wing well. A one-wheel landing in a 7-ton fighter was notoriously dangerous. The weight would instantly drag the wingtip into the dirt, potentially causing the aircraft to cartwheel violently and explode. But Terence had no other options. The engine was seconds away from completely seizing. He chopped the throttle, plunging the aircraft into a terrifying silence broken only by the shriek of the wind over the wings. He flared the heavy fighter just feet above the grassy runway, holding the right wing up with absolute, straining muscle power against the control stick. The left tire kissed the turf. The massive aircraft rolled forward at 100 miles an hour, bleeding speed. As the momentum slowed, Terence lost the aerodynamic authority to keep the right wing elevated. The heavy steel wingtip slammed into the earth. Dirt and grass exploded into the air as the massive P-47 violently pivoted to the right. The sheer inertia of the 7-ton machine tore a deep, jagged trench through the airfield. The remaining propeller blades struck the ground, violently curling backward like tin cans. The aircraft slid sideways for another 200 yards, a screeching, horrific symphony of tearing metal, before finally slamming to a halt in a cloud of dust and steam. Silence descended over the wreck. A minute later, British crash crews arrived in their red fire tenders, expecting to pull a mangled corpse from the ruined fuselage. Instead, they found Terence Hayes sitting in the cockpit, covered in black grease, his hands shaking as he slowly pushed the shattered canopy open. A seasoned RAF mechanic climbed onto the wing, his eyes wide as he inspected the catastrophic damage to the nose. He looked at the blown-off cylinder, the severed oil lines, and the cannon holes punched through the wing spar. "Bloody hell, mate," the mechanic breathed, extending a hand to help the American pilot out. By all the laws of God and physics, this aircraft should have fallen out of the sky an hour ago. "What is this thing made of?" Terence managed a weak, oil-stained smirk. "Iron. Pure, angry iron." By the spring of 1944, the freezing gray misery of the winter campaign had begun to thaw, bringing clear, crystalline skies over occupied Europe. But the weather was not the only thing that had fundamentally changed. The entire narrative of the aerial war had completely inverted. The arrogant laughter that had once echoed through the requisitioned French chateaux of the Luftwaffe had been utterly silenced, replaced by a grim, fatalistic dread that settled deep into the bones of every German pilot. The 56th Fighter Group, Hub Zemke's fiercely disciplined wolf pack, was no longer just surviving the skies over the continent. They were terrorizing them. The P-47 Thunderbolt had undergone critical, game-changing upgrades that stripped away its final vulnerabilities. The mechanics on the English airfields had fitted the massive Pratt & Whitney engines with broad, paddle blade propellers. These new blades aggressively clawed at the thin air of the stratosphere, drastically improving the heavy fighter's rate of climb and acceleration. Furthermore, the old, claustrophobic Razorback canopy had been replaced. Captain Terence Hayes now sat inside a massive, teardrop-shaped bubble canopy of a brand-new P-47D. For the first time, he had a completely unobstructed, 360-degree view of the sky. He could look over his shoulder and see his own tail, eliminating the deadly blind spots that had plagued the earlier models. And, perhaps most tellingly, his new aircraft was entirely unpainted. Stripped of its olive-drab camouflage, the Thunderbolt was bare, gleaming silver aluminum. The American High Command had realized that camouflage was for the hunted. The 8th Air Force wanted the Luftwaffe to see them coming from 50 miles away. The psychological impact of a massive, shining silver armada crossing the channel was devastating. The heavy fighter had also found a terrifying new secondary calling. Loaded with 5-inch high-velocity rockets and 500-pound bombs beneath its thick wings, the flying bathtubs routinely dropped down to the deck. They prowled the French countryside like armored predators, using their 8 50-caliber machine guns to annihilate German supply trains, shred armored convoys, and strafe enemy airfields into burning ruins. The pilots had affectionately and terrifyingly renamed their aircraft the Juggernaut, shortened simply by the men on the line to the Jug. On a crisp, brilliantly clear morning in March, Terence Hayes flew as the element leader in a massive, sweeping fighter offensive over the Abbeville area. The mission briefing had been remarkably straightforward. They were not shackled to the slow-moving heavy bombers today. This was a pure fighter sweep. Their sole objective was to aggressively hunt down the bleeding remnants of the Luftwaffe's elite Jagdgeschwader 26. Cruising comfortably at 22,000 feet, Terence rested his gloved hand lightly on the control stick. He breathed the cold, dry oxygen through his rubber mask, feeling a profound sense of calm. A year ago, flying over this exact terrain, he had been a terrified rookie praying that his lumbering machine would survive the Focke-Wulfs. Now, he was an apex predator, strapped into 7 tons of polished kinetic energy, waiting for the hunt to begin. Below them, skimming the broken cloud layer at 10,000 feet, Major Egon Mayer was leading a desperate interception flight. As the highly decorated commander of the Schlegeter Wing and a veteran of hundreds of brutal aerial battles, Mayer was a master tactician. He was the man who had famously pioneered the terrifying head-on attack against the American bomber boxes. But his once mighty and seemingly invincible fighter wing had been bled white by the relentless, grinding attrition of the heavy American escorts. Mayer's eyes, ringed with dark circles of exhaustion, continuously scanned the blinding glare of the morning sun. He was flying a war of mere survival now. He knew intimately how the Americans fought. They no longer made the mistake of turning. They fought entirely in the vertical, using their immense weight as a weapon of mass destruction. "Watch the sun, men," Mayer ordered his pilots over the crackling radio, his voice tight with fatigue and a creeping sense of inevitability. "The Thunderbolts will not dogfight us. They will fall like stones. Keep your speed high." High above in the freezing stratosphere, Terence was methodically searching the patchwork quilt of green and brown forests below. Through the pristine plexiglass of his bubble canopy, he caught the unmistakable, momentary glint of sunlight reflecting off mottled green and gray camouflage. He squinted, confirming the tight, finger-four formation of the enemy fighters hugging the tree line. The cold, predatory instinct instantly took over, slowing his heart rate to a steady, rhythmic thud. "Target spotted. 11 o'clock low," Terence radioed, his voice utterly devoid of panic, replaced by cold professionalism. "Looks like a flight of Focke-Wulfs. Let's bounce them." "Roger that, Blue Flight." "Put the hammer down," came the immediate, gravelly reply from the flight leader. In perfect unison, 4 heavy silver thunderbolts rolled inverted. For a fleeting second, Terence hung upside down against his shoulder straps, the vast expanse of the French earth completely filling his canopy. Then, he pulled the heavy stick back into his stomach, bringing the massive nose of the aircraft straight down toward the ground. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine roared, a deep, guttural, mechanical scream as gravity seized the 7-ton machine. The superchargers howled, packing dense air into the cylinders as the aircraft accelerated past 400, then 450 miles per hour. The familiar, terrifying, high-speed vibration rattled through Terence's flight stick, shaking his teeth within his jaw. He was no longer just a pilot. He was a human warhead, strapped to a silver missile plummeting from the heavens. Down below, Mayer's seasoned peripheral vision caught the silver flashes tearing through the upper atmosphere. He immediately recognized the sheer speed and the fatal geometry of the attack. It was the exact same tactic that had killed Karl von Richt and dozens of his finest men. "Break into them! Break upwards!" Mayer shouted into his throat microphone, violently yanking his FW-190 into a brutal, climbing turn. It was a brilliant, desperate, defensive maneuver, executed flawlessly by a master of his craft. By pulling up and turning directly into the path of the diving Americans, Mayer was attempting to ruin their angle of attack, forcing them to alter their dive trajectory and hopefully bleed off their overwhelming kinetic momentum. Against a Spitfire or a Mustang, it might have saved his life, but Terence anticipated the turn perfectly. He didn't try to pull his heavy fighter horizontally to match Mayer's tight climbing circle. He knew the Thunderbolt would never win that turning fight. Instead, Terence simply widened the arc of his dive, utilizing the sheer, ungodly terminal velocity of his descent to effortlessly cut across the geometry of Mayer's desperate evasion. Mayer looked upward, through the reinforced glass of his armored canopy, his heart sinking like a stone into his stomach. The unpainted silver American fighter was closing the distance with terrifying, mathematical rapidity. The P-47 was too heavy, falling too fast, and possessed entirely too much kinetic energy to be evaded by a simple flick of the wrist. The massive radial engine filled Mayer's entire field of vision, a wall of iron descending upon him. At precisely 350 yards, Terence depressed the red firing button on the control column. The sky instantly erupted into a blinding tempest of fire. The combined firepower of 32 heavy machine guns from the diving American flight converged on the small, scattered German formation. From Terence's wings alone, 8 50 caliber Brownings spat a solid, inescapable wall of armor-piercing incendiary rounds. The violent recoil physically shuddered the 7-ton Thunderbolt, filling the cockpit with the sharp, acidic stench of cordite. Mayer's W-190, caught completely exposed at the agonizingly slow apex of its climbing turn, flew directly into the center of the devastating barrage. There was no glancing blow. The heavy American bullets acted like an industrial buzzsaw. They shredded the left wing of the German fighter, snapping the main duralumin spar like a dry, hollow twig. A second, concentrated burst chewed through the engine cowling, instantly detonating the pressurized, high-octane fuel lines. Major Egon Mayer, one of the most formidable, respected, and lethal aces of the Luftwaffe, was killed instantly as his sleek aircraft disintegrated into a violently tumbling, brilliant, orange fireball. Terence immediately hauled back on his control stick with both hands, feeling the immense, crushing G-force push the blood out of his head and pin him deep into his seat cushions. The massive juggernaut absorbed the punishing aerodynamic stress with ease, its terrifying momentum effortlessly catapulting it straight back up into the safety of the upper atmosphere, leaving the shattered, burning remnants of the Luftwaffe elite raining down upon the European forest floor below. The entire engagement had lasted less than 20 seconds. It was short, brutally efficient, and entirely one-sided. As Terence finally leveled out his heavy silver fighter at 20,000 feet, adjusting his trim tabs and setting his compass heading back toward the English Channel, the radio remained remarkably quiet. He gently patted the thick, cold armor plating bolted to the side of his cockpit. A year ago, the Germans had laughed at the ungainly shape, the preposterous weight, and the perceived clumsiness of the American machine. They had firmly believed that the era of the aerial knight, the nimble, pirouetting dogfighter, dancing through the clouds, would last forever. They had been violently, tragically wrong. The sky no longer belonged to the dancers. It belonged to the heavyweights. The era of the flying bathtub had unequivocally arrived, and it had been forged in an unyielding, unforgiving crucible of fire, speed, and lead. The evolution of the P-47 Thunderbolt remains one of the most dramatic, technological, and tactical shifts in the history of aerial warfare. Initially mocked for its gargantuan size and poor low-speed maneuverability, the Jug forced pilots to entirely rewrite the rules of aerial combat. By utilizing its immense weight, structural invulnerability, and the devastating kinetic energy of its dives, American pilots transformed a perceived liability into an inescapable death sentence for the Luftwaffe. It proved that in the brutal mathematics of modern air combat, raw horsepower, gravity, and the staggering broadside of 8 50 caliber machine guns could decisively defeat the graceful agility of traditional dogfighters. The Thunderbolt finished the war not as a joke, but as a legendary symbol of industrial might, a flying tank that broke the back of German air power and paved the way for Allied victory.